Good. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to our homegrown lecture series. This is going to be our first May lecture. The next one coming up in 2 weeks is all about basil. And today we have history of cattle in Texas. We do have our next quarter schedule, and if you can change that slide. There we go. So the next quarter schedule is up and available for you to register. And remember, you don't have to register one at a time. You can take a look over all the topics and register for all of them that you would like to attend. And so that's going to cover April, May, and June. And again, these are offered twice a month. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to have our Harris County AgriLife A&R, Agriculture Natural Resources Agent, Shannon Dietz. He is going to be talking about the history of cattle in Texas. And I'm going to pop his picture up here so you can see that anyone who has a question, you can refer to him as
Trail Boss.
The Trail Boss. There you go. There you go, Shannon.
Okay, all right.
Welcome.
Thanks, Brandy. Howdy, everyone. Yes, my name is Shannon Dietz. I'm the County Ag Agent here for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension based in Harris County. And I'm excited to come to you today with a really neat presentation. And it's going to be a little change up on what we've done or what I've done in the past and so forth. So we're going to start diving a little bit more into the role of agriculture here in Texas and everything. A couple of my future presentations are going to include the history of sausage making. So that's going to be a good one. And then we're also have on schedule one that we're going to touch on dairy, the dairy industry in Texas, and how it's played an important role. We often talk a lot about cattle, but dairy is in that family of cattle, but it is separate for their produce and everything, or their product that they produce, which is milk and so forth. So, but anyway, we're going to get started with this. I'm excited to have you all here. Welcome to the people here in Texas and those who might be viewing from far and away. So we're in Texas, and we're going to talk about cattle, obviously, and the history of how it played a role in the development of our great state. So, cowboys and cowgirls, it's time to roll up your bedrolls, saddle your horses, and we're going to get started on the trail today. So we're going to be sharing some information with you. Hopefully that is going to be some interesting history of the state of Texas, history of cattle, and how Texas has kind of come to develop around that area. We're going to be talking specifically about the Spanish influence and how it created the history of Tejas. Whenever we were under the Spanish reign, and we had several different countries that were vying for land here in Texas. The Spaniards, the French, the Spaniards, French, and there's one, but I can't remember right now. I forgot. But we're going to talk about how the cattle drive shaped the history of Texas, and we're going to talk a little bit about cattle drives. We're going to talk about men, women, and ranches of Texas. We're specifically going to talk about a king and a queen of the cattle in Texas. You might not know that we have royalty in Texas for cattle, but coming across some of my history, we've definitely came across some interesting stuff like that. We're going to talk about the life of the American cowboy, and whether what we saw in the movies and the black and whites, maybe growing up and so forth, was actually what the original American cowboy dealt with on the range and so forth. And then we're going to kind of wrap it up with the resurgence of the Texas Longhorn, which has kind of become synonymous with the state of Texas and so forth. A lot of times when you see Texas, you automatically see Texas Longhorns in the pictures or what have you, usually in the bluebonnet fields. So bluebonnets, and Texas Longhorns are kind of synonymous whenever you think and see of Texas right away. So those are some key points we're going to touch on today. And first, we're going to talk about the Spanish influence on Tejas history. The word ranch is derived from the word ranchero. Way back before United States or North America was developed and so forth, like I said, we talked a little bit about Texas being under Spanish influence. And the Spaniards really, the Mexicans really shaped a lot of the foundation of Texas. It goes back to about the 1730s, early 1700s, really along the San Antonio River from the Mexicans coming in. With that was basically with the missionaries or the missions that were established here in the areas of Texas. We still have a lot of those that are National Historic Sites. Obviously, the most important one is the Alamo down in San Antonio, and we all know the history behind that, but that might be something we talk about a little bit later on and so forth. But there were missions scattered throughout the state of Texas, and that kind of developed how that history really came forward and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's kind of funny because in doing my research, Spanish and Mexican ranches were not really called by the owner's names or brand, which we often hear about now. That's how, King Ranch, Santa Gertrudis Ranch and different things like that. So they were obviously, they went with other names, Ojo de Agua, La Pata, and Santa Gertrudis. Santa Gertrudis is actually a popular cattle breed. So you can see that they used other names other than their brands or their names. And these still survive down at the Kennedy Ranch and the King Ranch in Kleberg, Texas. That is down along the coast towards the Brownsville area. So that is definitely still up and running and playing a prominent role in the cattle industry here in Texas. So we talked a little bit about the Franciscan priests that came with the missions, and they were the actual first cattle ranchers here in Texas because they were given the authority to manage the livestock. Not only were they to spread the word of God and help those people develop their religions and so forth, but they also were in charge of the chickens, the cows, the goats, the horses, and so forth like that. So it's kind of funny that the priests were actually what they call the first ranchers in Texas, and it kind of developed from there. Some Spanish terms that, again, carried over into that Spanish influence in Texas and just being with the cattle drive and American cattle history and so forth. Mostrico means no other owner. That became changed to the word maverick. So you often hear of some animals being a maverick, but that developed from that word Mostrico. Mestizo means the ownerless, referring to cattle and horses, which became Mustang in the American language. And these were cattle that were just out on the range. They didn't really have any branding. They didn't belong to anybody or anything like that. So until they were actually branded, because at one time the United States was just open borders, obviously. So there was pasture everywhere. There was green grass. There was native grass everywhere. And that was very beneficial to having cattle prosper and horses and different things like that. So it was a wide open space. And so we had, and we still have a lot of maverick horses out in the West and so forth, where we have open range and so forth. We have a lot of those cattle, horses that are just native to that area and so forth. Orango indicated the unbranded animal, and the ora means ear. So that's usually where the cattle is branded. So that takes that translation from there. The chaparreros or chaparras, and I'm saying them the best I can, so I apologize if I'm murdering the Spanish language, so I'm trying. So, but those are words both reference the word chaps. And as you know, with the American Cowboy, or if you ever watch any type of rodeo events or anything like that, chaps are still part and an important part of the American history of the cattle, and they still the cowboy, and they still wear those. And lastly, we talk about the lasso. If you've ever watched a Western movie or any type of thing like that, you've seen many cowboys experience and show off their expertise, I guess, with the lasso. It is not easy to do by any means, but it came from the Spanish term la riata. So you can see by those words there, we still have a lot of crossover terms, and those names eventually became Americanized, and that's what we got there. So going back with the cattle, we're going to talk a little bit about Civil War years, and a lot of people don't realize that Texas furnished beef to the Confederacy until late in the Civil War, up until about 1863, whenever the Confederacy was defeated. You know, our economy here in the South was pretty much shot. There was no really economy to per se to survive off of. The cotton industry was pretty much devastated. A lot of the rivers were set up with blockades. The rail system was pretty much destroyed by the Yankees and so forth like that. So it was really hard to get cattle, which Texas had plenty of, to our neighboring states or other places of the United States where they could take advantage of a little bit higher prices for them. You could see that at one time, cattle prices at the end of the year, the end of the war, averaged anywhere from about 25 to 30 cents per pound, you know, on the East Coast and so forth. So cattle was extremely cheap, what we think of in this time, but during that time where the economy had really tanked and a lot of people didn't have the resources or the money or anything like that, you can see that there was definitely a need for cattle and meat throughout the area and so forth, and throughout the United States. So a Texas steer could be bought for about $6 to $10, but this led to the development of the cattle trail. And at the end of the cattle trail, we're talking about like whenever cattle were actually brought on foot and herded up into the central part of the United States, or out west to San Francisco, or up to Nebraska and so forth like that, to meet those rail lines. You could get actually about $30 to $40 per head on those steers. And so this, you know, with the introduction of the cattle drives, obviously this became important. This became an important entrepreneurship to a lot of people who were seeing opportunities from the availability of cattle. Thousands and thousands of cattle just roaming the state of Texas that weren't owned by anybody because they weren't branded. All right, at that time you had to have a brand on your cattle, and we're going to talk a little bit about branding a little bit later on, but there was no ownership of those cattle if they were not branded. So they were free range cattle. So basically, if you had an operation and a ranch or some type of confinement that you could gather these cattle on and you could brand them, they automatically became yours. So with the entrepreneurs, you know, we talked about a couple of names that pop up here. Richard King. Richard King is definitely known for the King Ranch. At one time, it roughly had about 850,000 acres. We talked about the King Ranch earlier. It's down in Cleburne County along the coast. And it happens to be along the coast because Richard King was actually a steamboat captain, and he fought in the Confederacy. And whenever the war was over, he went back to South Texas and started claiming land from the Spanish area at that time. And so again, he had the opportunity to gather a whole bunch of cattle and everything like that. So we're lucky that we have the history of the King Ranch still available with us, and the brand is actually a W. I think it might be on one of my slides a little bit later on when we talk about branding and everything, but his name and that ranch has been really marketed amazingly. Still a couple hundred years later, we have a lot of Ford trucks that are the King Ranch truck. They're branded with King Ranch. The leather in the truck is branded with the King Ranch brand. So obviously it stayed around for many, many years, and people are still familiar with it. And that still tends to be one of the most popular ranches here in Texas. CC Slaughter, I'm not sure if many of you recognize this name, but if you, it's kind of interesting when I was doing research on this guy. The CC actually stands for Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus Slaughter was actually known as the king of cattle in Texas. We talked earlier about royalty and kings and queens in Texas and so forth. Mr. Slaughter was a banker. He also fought in the Civil War for the Confederacy. And after the war was over, he came back to Texas and moved around quite a bit. He was an entrepreneur, like I said. He was also a banker and an investor and so forth. And he started out actually in East Texas, I think around the area of Sabine County, which is north, that kind of like in the Piney Woods area of Texas. And then he eventually moved out west, where there were millions and thousands of acres, yeah, millions, probably more than thousands, because as obviously, the state of Texas is humongous. But he started his operation out there, and so he started developing some cattle drives up in that area that would lead out to San Francisco and Nebraska himself. And we're going to show you a little slide coming up that's going to talk about the different cattle drives and the way they traveled and different things. The last one we're going to talk about is Charles Goodnight. Mr. Charles had an interesting, I guess, history. He is known for developing some important things that we're going to talk about on the cattle drive in a slide later on down the road. But just keep his name in mind, and we're going to come back and talk about him in a little bit. So we talked about a lot of the open pastures and open range here in Texas and so forth, and it was an opportunity for cattle and people to just utilize the land without having to worry about it until the invention of 1874, when barbed wire was introduced. And that kind of really divided your pastures and your acreage, and really allowed people to kind of start settling in a particular area, because you could mark your homestead by the security of barbed wire, actually. And I apologize for my accent. But it is known as barbed wire. In case some of you might not know what it is a strong metal wire, and I should have put a picture of it in here, but it's roped wire, and it has little sharp pointed spikelets, probably about every 5 or 6 inches on it. And it comes in round bales, and what it is it can be nailed or basically nailed or stapled to fence posts, and that is your automatic fence. And the cattle would not go past the barbed wire. There was actually early testing of it. They did research and development back then. They would test the strength of the barbed wire and so forth with people would bring cattle in, and they were supposed to be very unruly, and they were hard to keep control and everything. And when they fenced them in this barbed wire and everything, the barbed wire held up really well. So it really became very popular in the state of Texas. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Cowboys and the Hollywood glamour of it, and all the people that played famous cowboys: John Wayne, Roy Rogers, several of them that are out there. And looking back on those older movies now, there was some gunfights every now and then, but mostly all the cowboys had really nice clothes. They had clean clothes. They always had enough food to eat. They usually had a place to stay in and different things like that. So that wasn't always necessarily the case with the actual history of the American cowboy. Most cowboys, young, lean, medium-sized guys that were after the war, they didn't really have any jobs or anything like this, and so this was their way of earning some money, but still also being free at the same time. And they were not inclusive to just white people. We had African Americans, white, Hispanic, and females out on the cattle drives and playing an important role in the cattle industry in Texas. They usually didn't own their own horse, but they did own their saddle. A lot of the cattle drives had extra horses that came with the cattle drive because of the many miles that they traveled. So they had to keep the horses fresh and so forth. So horses weren't always ridden. There was some extras that were brought along for the ride and stuff like that. So as long as they had their saddle and their bedroll, they were good to go. And today's equivalent, they made about $300 a year for an American cowboy. I thought this was pretty cool, this quote and this picture. I loved it for the fact that it had the dog in it, and the dog is just like smiling, bright-eyed and so forth. Definitely the dogs played a lot or an important role in the cattle industry as well. Blue heelers, have always been synonymous with cattle drives and so forth, herding cattle and so forth like that, when they could get in areas that necessarily the cowboy or the horse couldn't get into and get the cattle out. But interesting quote here: in character, there never was like or will be again. They were intensely loyal to the outfit they were working for and would fight to the death for it. They would follow their wagon boss through hell and never complain. I've seen them ride into camp after 2 days and nights on herd, lay down and saddle blankets in the rain and sleep like dead men. They get up laughing and joking about some good time they had in Dodge City. Living that kind of life, they were bound to be wild and brave. In fact, there was only two things that old-time cowpunchers were afraid of: a decent woman and being set afoot. So they always treated their horses very well whenever they did have the opportunity to buy a horse and so forth. But otherwise, that was their car to them. That was their transportation. So to be set afoot and have to walk everywhere was not definitely part of the image of the American cowboy. So early cattle drives started about 1866 when the northern and western markets really opened up, and the need and the desire for American beef and Texas beef in particular really became at high demand. So the first one started when there was about 200,000 cattle crossing over the Red River, just in North Texas and Oklahoma and so forth. The cattle drives usually started in early spring because that's when you had an influx of the greening of the pastures, not only here in Texas, but all up through the Midwest. So you had constantly a feed source. As long as you had water and you had pasture, you were good to go. All right. It wasn't like today where you had to carry bags or sacks of feed or anything like this on the trail. These were strictly cattle that were grazing, and their 100% of their food source came from the native pastures and the water. Interesting thing about cattle drives is that they do not travel, in my research, they don't travel in groups, okay? What they do is they travel actually in long lines. So there was different cattlemen or different rancheros that were placed throughout the cattle line. And so that was, in every herd, you always had the natural leaders of the cattle to take lead, all right? And you had to have that happen in order for the rest of the herd to follow. You had your older cattle, sometimes your pregnant cattle towards the end where it was a little bit slower and so forth. You had your faster moving cattle, those that weren't afraid to go through water because you crossed a lot of rivers, you crossed some creeks and different things like that. So if you didn't have the first couple cattle to actually lead the group through there, it was almost impossible to get the rest of them to go back to cross that water. One of the things that was very dangerous in the times of the cattle drive was the word stampede. Stampedes were very common among cattle drives, and it was a very dangerous thing, not only for the cattle, but also for the American cowboys that were working them. Stampedes could be set off by anything. A lot of times they were set off by lightning. when they were traveling and they might be going through a thunderstorm. Sometimes a gunshot could set off a stampede. It really didn't matter. Sometimes the little bit of reaction towards a set of cattle, and they would get riled up. And what would happen during a cattle stampede is that the cattle, and you're talking about longhorn cattle, okay, you have a horn spread of usually about 4 to 5 feet, okay, and so these horns are not dull. They can be short. That is a defense mechanism of theirs. And so when you have several cattle, couple hundred cattle, actually, some of these cattle drives actually had about anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 cattle in it. So you're talking about a lot of horns and a lot of 800,000-pound cows, 1,200-pound steers, and so forth. So there was quite a bit of a force behind that. So what would happen is, in an experienced cowboy, when there was a stampede that would get started, they would take the first couple of the lead steers and actually bring them back around and head them off in a circle. And then so the object was to make a circular motion with the steers, and that would eventually calm them down, okay? Because if you had a stampede and they just went rogue, cattlemen could be, again, knocked off their cows, their horses. They could be stumbled to death. A lot of cows are killed by one another by accident with the horns and the stampeding. Some of the older cattle might not be able to get out of the way and so forth. And then when that happens, they just spread out everywhere. So usually it took a couple of days afterwards, if you didn't have experienced cattlemen working the stampede, you would have to spend a couple, 3 days, 4 days, or 5 days, or whatever, getting all those cattle back together. And that was missed opportunity, because you had to add that time onto your overall trip, where you could have been making much more progress with that and everything. So stampedes were a very dangerous thing. There's history that goes way back, talks about some of the accidents that have happened and so forth and everything. So really was a concern of the cowboy. A 12-man crew could manage about 2,000 to 3,000 head, and the trail boss was the most important. But who was number 2? It's a little info. I'm just gonna leave that for you as we switch to the next slide. So who do you think the second most important person on the cattle drive was after the trail boss? But a little bit more information, and we're going to come back to that. Cattle drives covered about 10 to 15 miles per day. Nowadays, you think about that, oh man, I can get in my car and I can be, in Austin in an hour or 2 hours, from here. I can be in San Antonio in about 3 hours. I can be in Dallas in 4 hours and so forth. And those are hundreds and hundreds of miles. But think about back then, on horseback, in all different types of weather, whether it be cold, whether it be stormy or anything like that. Those were all things they had to deal with. A drive from Kansas to Texas could take anywhere between 25 and 100 days. You think about 365 days and you're knocking 100 days off of it on a cattle drive. Again, that depended on delays which might be incurred with Indian tribes, swollen rivers, droughts, and stampedes that we just talked about. Interesting fact that I came across on the calves that were born on the trail. Early on, the calves were actually killed because they could not keep up with the herd. And so, but once they figured out that there was a cash value for the calves, several of the trail bosses and ranches decided that, or developed a system that when the cattle, when a calf was born, they would put it in a sack, okay? And they would carry it in a special wagon. So all the calves that were born, they would put them in a sack, they would put them in a wagon, and that wagon would travel with the rest of the herd. And then at night, when they would stop to rest and let the cattle graze and sleep and so forth. And when the cowboys were sleeping, they would take the calves out the sacks and then let them reunite with the mothers so they could feed off the milk and get that development there and so forth. And then during the day, they would put them back in the sack again and put them on the trail and off to go with the rest of them. So I thought that was kind of interesting of how that came about. Interesting. So next couple of things, we're going to show some historic pictures on that I came across on the American Cattle Drive, and some pictures of cowboys in their natural setting and so forth. And I thought these were just really interesting to share. You know, you can see in the picture the pen of the extra horses in the back that would travel with the cattle drive. Those were the fresh horses that they would switch out with every now and then. But you could see each of them have a lasso on the side of their horse, and they all have a cowboy hat. They all have the chaps on, and so that's kind of all stuff we talked about there. So that was a pretty cool picture. We also talked about cowboys being, you know, welcoming of all races. In this picture, we have a black cattle, African-American cattle cowboy, and we have a Hispanic cowboy in the picture. So really great historical pieces that we can refer back to. I want to take a step here and talk about how women played an important role in the development of the cattle drives and so forth. And there's two ladies here that I want to highlight real quick. Just checking my time. And I want to tell you a little bit about each one of them. So the first one is Lizzie Johnson. So Lizzie Johnson, her family moved to Texas. They were on the east side of Texas when she was about 4 years old, and she grew up. Both of her parents were teachers, and they had a private school. And Lizzie actually went to college to become a teacher, and she actually eventually started her own school around the Austin area. And as a sideline, she worked with a lot of the cattle people in that area, doing bookkeeping work and just kind of working around the farm. She was one of these people that liked to really be outside and stuff like that. And she really had a keen interest in the cattle industry and so forth. She actually registered a brand under her name, and people still register brands today for the cattle industry. And just in case anybody wants to know, you have to register that with the clerk of court in the county that you have your cattle in, okay? Just in case anybody was wondering about that. But anyway, getting back to Lizzie, she had a long history. She participated. She was one of the first ladies to participate in the Chisholm Trail cattle drive, which was no small feat on her part and so forth. So she still taught school and everything. And then she actually eventually ran into a cowboy that she really fell head over heels for, and she married him. But unfortunately, her husband wasn't as quick on the cattle industry as she was. He didn't have as a keen eye. Miss Lizzie was really ahead of her time, because she was one of the first persons that I know of that got her husband to sign a prenuptial, that in case they would ever divorce or anything like that, what was hers, and what was his. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Way back in the 1800s, that prenups were actually signed, and she was smart to do that and so forth. She didn't want to trade or exchange her money and have it treat, you know, and so forth like that, or shared with her husband and so forth. So like I said, she had to bail him out several times. Funny story is that they actually had ranches that they purchased down in Cuba, in addition to what they had in Texas. And her husband, actually, when checking the ranch one time in Cuba, got kidnapped, and she had to pay a $50,000 reward to release the hostage, you know, for his release to the hostages and so forth. And kind of wrap up her story, when he came back after several more years, you know, he eventually passed away. She outlived him, and they were living in Austin at this time. And his funeral cost somewhere at that time around $600, which was pretty high for that time. But she always took care of him. She never, even though she had her own money and everything like that. And then rumor is that loved that old buzzard. And so she actually died many years later in downtown Austin. She became kind of like a recluse in a building that she bought. And at the time of her death, she had about $250,000 of estate and jewelry and cattle and everything in her name, which equaled to about $3 million nowadays and stuff. So she did really, really well for herself. And then Margaret Borland is another successful cattlewoman. Lizzie Johnson was known as the queen of the Texas cattle. So we talked about the king and we talked about the queen. So Lizzie was known as the queen of Texas cattle. Margaret Borland came over from Ireland with her family, and she actually ended up settling in Texas. Quick story about her is that she also had a good eye for cattle and was a hard worker and worked the cattle industry very well, become very proficient in it and in buying and, well, not buying, but gathering a lot of these rogue cattle, these Texas Longhorns that were out there just roaming the native grasslands and so forth, and she would brand them. She would eventually add to her stock and so forth like that. After her husband died, she had 3 small children, and these cattle needed to get to Kansas to the railroad station there where they had a contract to purchase them. She took her 3 small children and herself, and she became the trail boss on that particular cattle drive. And they got as far as Kansas, and she actually died on the way up there. And she wasn't like killed by Indians or anything like that. I think at that time they called it, she had like a mental breakdown, and she had other ailments and different things like that. So anyway, the 3 small children, the family took over the business and so forth, but she was very successful in her career and so forth, and was not afraid to get on a horse with the rest of the cowboys and so forth. So those are 2 women. Definitely have a lot more history on them if you ever want to research them. There's lots of books and articles written on either one of those. Talk a little bit about branding. We talked about how this became your ownership papers for cattle. People would create a brand that wouldn't be easily altered by other people, because you had a lot of cattle rustlers, obviously. In the old days, before the one brand that was made with your family name on it or whatever, it was a series of tattoos that had to be done. And the branding always took place on the right, or the hump end, or the rump end of the steer. You didn't want to put it anywhere else on the neck or on the side or anything like that, because one of the byproducts that people were getting a lot of money off of was the cattle hides, the leather industry and so forth. So anytime you burned a brand anywhere other than that tail end rump area, it would mess up the hide, all right? And you would get a lower value for that hide and so forth. So it was very important on the placement and how you were branded and so forth and everything. And so these are a couple of them. One that I just want to point out was on that top row, Stephen F. Austin's Spanish brand on the top row right in the middle. Again, there are several places in Texas that you can go that there are thousands and thousands of brands across the state of Texas. A lot of them are kept up, even though they don't have ranches anymore, just for historical purposes and so forth. Here we go, the Cowboy Chuck Wagon. We talked about earlier, I asked the question, who was the second most important person on the cattle drive? And here we go, here's your answer right here. The cook, all right? The cook was the guy that was responsible for feeding all the cowboys, keeping track of the inventory. You could see his traveling kitchen there. The Chuck Wagon actually was developed by Mr. Charles Goodnight. Remember, we talked about him earlier. He I guess he had to try and figure out a way to help his cattlemen when they get on these long drives and so forth, how they could keep up with food and everything, and that it wasn't just tied down with horses and stuff like that. So he actually took a wagon and added a whole bunch of different compartments onto it. You could see he had a fold down board there with that would help with food preparation. He installed a lot of different drawers and that and cabinets that would store stuff and everything like that. And then he always cooked on open fire and different things like that. So the cattle, the chef, or I say the chef, the cook on the chuck wagon, he was the second most popular guy, and he also earned about $60 a month. So he was right under the trail boss as far as importance on keeping everybody fed. And we can see he was invented, like I said, by Mr. Goodnight in 1866. It was pulled by either oxen or mules, and it carried not only utensils, but a water barrel, the crew roll beds, and so forth. And then also during the daytime, it also carried all the guns and the ammunition and everything of all the cowboys, because the last thing they wanted to do was have their gun go off whenever they were out, like trying to lasso cattle or anything like that. Unless they had them on hand whenever they knew they were coming up into like hostile territory with the Indian tribes and so forth. But again, that was all set up way before. Had a fold-out counter we talked about for food prep, and it was all covered by a canvas top. You can see an older picture here of chuck wagon cook, and the menu. How could we forget the menu? Day after day, guys. It wasn't Shoney's, and it wasn't anything really to write home about or anything. So they had either beef or bison steaks, and when you think about it, this was fresh meat. They didn't have to carry anything with refrigeration or anything like that, because they didn't have refrigeration at the time. So they either killed what they had either on the cattle drive that was dedicated for meat purposes, or they would kill buffalo or bison on their cattle trails and stuff like that, and they would use that as fresh meat. SOB stew, I thought that was kind of funny, made from a variety of calf parts, it said. So that probably wasn't the most favorite meal of the cowboys for the day, but that was a big part of it as well. So the next couple ones, I'm going to test your knowledge and see if you knew what chuck wagon chicken was. And I was kind of surprised on this one because it doesn't refer or it doesn't imply anything on what it actually is. Chuck wagon chicken is actually referred to as bacon. So I don't know why chicken and bacon. I don't know. But anyway, that was kind of funny. Pecos strawberries. Don't know how that name was derived either, but that was basically pork and beans. So Pecos strawberries, sourdough bullets. That one's kind of easy to figure out. That was probably your homemade, your scratch biscuits, and then topped it all off with some real strong Cowboy coffee. Can you guess this cattle brand? Some of you might have seen it before. Some of you might not have. If you're a real aficionado of Texas history, you might know what it is. But this is actually the ranch that helped build the state capitol. This is 10 in Texas. XIT, X is the 10 in Texas. This was a combination of 10 counties up in the panhandle of Texas that was sold, about 3 million acres sold to several developers up and around the Chicago area, and also a couple of Europeans that helped purchase this land, a little over 3 million acres that the state sold them. This was in response to the state capitol burning in the late 1800s in Austin. And so 3 million acres was sold for $3 million. And that $3 million was used to build the new capitol in Austin, that Sunset granite that it's known for, that real popular granite. Just a quick note about the state capitol. It is the largest state capitol in the United States. Everything's bigger here in Texas, and it actually rivals the size of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Supposedly it's higher. The dome has actually been adjusted here in Austin so that it is actually the tallest building, or taller than the U.S. Capitol and so forth. So some interesting facts there, but that ranch has actually been broken up. It is no longer in existence, but it is always going to play an important part in the history of Texas. We talked a little bit about cattle drives of the American West, and I mentioned the Chisholm Trail. That's a pretty popular one. You hear that one a lot when you're talking about cattle drive history and so forth. The Chisholm Trail is one that basically I tried to do the colors to match the lines on the map as well as possible. But the Chisholm Trail is the one that actually starts down here in Brownsville and works its way up through Austin, Waco, Fort Worth, the Red River, and then into Oklahoma, and then into Kansas, and then finally into Nebraska. The Goodnight Loving Trail, interesting about this one, that was the one with Charles Goodnight, and he hooked up with this other rancher, Mr. Loving, on one of his trips and so forth, and they combined their herd, their cattle drive, and it roughly, the numbers were around 2,000 people. Anyway, long story short, Mr. Loving actually died from a wound he received in an Indian attack in New Mexico on their drive to get their cattle up to Colorado. So Mr. Goodnight continued to live, but on Mr. Loving's deathbed, his final words were, he asked Mr. Goodnight that he wanted to have his body buried in Woodworth, Texas. And so they interred the body of Mr. Loving when he died in New Mexico. They finished the cattle drive. When they came back, they took the body out of the ground. And this is the kind of strange part. So history has told us that Mr. Goodnight got his cowboys to smash a whole bunch of metal oil cans into thin layers, and they actually made a copy, I guess, around the coffin of Mr. Loving, and then they took charcoal ashes and filled it in between the tin layer and the wood of the coffin, and then they sealed it with a tin layer as well. And then they used that to transport, and I don't know why the use of the charcoal ashes and the tin and different things like that, other than just bringing maybe the casket has started to deteriorate already, I don't know, or whatever. But he fulfilled his promise to Mr. Loving that he would get him back to Texas, and he was actually buried in the Woodworth Cemetery. So word and promise went a long way among cattlemen during that back time. Other ones there, you see Shawnee Trail, the Potter Bacon Trail, and the Western Trail. And guys, these are many, 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 many miles, thousands of miles that cattle would have to travel, horses would have to travel. And cattle driving this far does not make for very tender meat. For those of you know that in the cattle industry, the more strenuous exercise and so forth that cattle were put under, the Longhorn cattle had very lean, tall legs, so they didn't have really, they were very good for walking. They were very disease resistant. They withstood the heat very well, but they didn't have a lot of meat on them, or the meat that was there was very stringy, very tough when it got to the market. But we've come a long way as far as the cattle industry and what we strive for as far as meat production, tenderness, nutritional value, and different things like that. So just kind of goes to show you how far we've advanced the cattle industry. The Texas Longhorn dates back to about the 1400s, and we're getting ready to wrap this up. Cattle are not native to America. They were first introduced by gold-seeking Spanish conquistadors that came from the Cuba areas and so forth, and they brought these conquistadors. They wanted beef to eat, so they brought them from the East Indies and so forth in that area, and they brought them over to Mexico. And then once in Mexico, they started to free range. All right, there was really no natural predators because of their horns and different things. They were very, like I said, heat tolerant, disease resistance, and so forth like that. And so these 6 cows set course for Mexico. He branded them with the 3 crosses, and the first brands, this was actually the first brands recorded in North America. These cattle eventually made their way up into Tejas, or what we call Texas now, still part of the Spanish territory and so forth. And then in 1995, Texas declared the longhorn the state mammal by the legislature. There was actually almost where there was almost an end to the Texas Longhorn at one time, because even though they were disease resistant, they were prone to carry the fever, which was a tick that was found on a lot of these cattle, and it would cause sickness among other cattle. And so a lot of ranchers and so forth felt like they needed to quarantine their states and so forth. So at one time, the cattle industry got really close to being on the decline because of they didn't want the cattle tick getting mixed up with their herds and so forth like that. So it was very tricky. There was actually a developer who worked for Texas A&M University. At that time, it was Texas Agriculture and Mechanical University, a biologist there that developed a spray, I guess, or a dip, if you will, that cattle will run through, and then it would coat the skin and so forth, and it would kill the ticks and so forth. So with the development of that vaccine by a Texas A&M University faculty member, the longhorn industry was survived and it went on. So we have a couple pictures of some beautiful cattle here. You can see how their horns really spread out. Some of them have some curved nature and so forth. These horns are very valuable once the cattle pass away. You see a lot of these people pay good prices for them. The horn is actually attached to the skull by bone, and then it's keratin on the outside that builds up the layers of the horns. So those horns are actually attached to the skull, and both male and female longhorn have horns. So you can't say that some, it's just the bulls or the steers or anything like that. It's the females as well. And you can see that they're very popular in the red color. And then this other spotted color is like a roan. One of the very distinctive features, ROAN, it's a mixture of red and white. Beautiful mama there and her calf by her side. And then you can see that just a beautiful animal, a beautiful part of Texas history and so forth. And so glad that preservation efforts are still around, that people have herds here in Texas to remember what the cattle industry was like at that time. Texas today still plays an important role in the economy. The cattle plays an important role in Texas economy. In 2017, Texas grossed $10.5 billion in production. Now, this is not just from longhorn cattle. We've really expanded into a lot of different breeds. Development has come a long way. The Brahmas, Santa Gertrudis, Angus with the development and the introduction of some English breeds. So we've had a lot of crossbreeding and so forth, and really had an opportunity to pick out what are some of the best quality traits in this particular cattle. And in this one, Brahma is known for their heat tolerance, their ability to go for water for quite a few days. So those are characters that we can breed with other cattle that might have more marbling in the meat and so forth. And technology has really come a long way with how the American public sees the beef cattle industry and so forth. Texas is #1 in beef production, and we are home to just under 130.2 million acres and ranches in the state of Texas. All right, guys, so that wraps up the cattle trail for today. I've been your trail boss, Shannon Dietz, County Ag Agent here in Harris County. My resources today came from a variety of them. The Texas Historical Commission, a couple links there. Ranching, the State Historical Association, and the Cattle Folk Story. If you would like to have me reach out and share some of these resources with you, or if you would like me to speak at a presentation on this to a group or something like that, we're always welcome to do that. I would appreciate the invite, and let us know in the survey that you're going to be filling out afterwards if you would like to see a part 2 of this, or maybe other ag industry that might be important in the role of Texas, or continue the conversation on the cattle part. So with that being said, that is the end of my presentation. So I am going to turn it back over to Brandy and Paul to wrap up and to share any comments that might need to be made at this time.
All right, Shannon, thank you. That was pretty cool.
Thank you, ma'am.
That was a good one. So the one question we have is, would the cattle drive take place only from Texas to Kansas, or other states as well?
No, other states as well. So the starting point was here in Texas, just because of the availability and the huge number that we had in Texas. But keep in mind, we went north to Kansas and Nebraska. The cattle drives would go out west to San Francisco for the markets out there, and they would even actually, some of the first cattle drives actually headed towards the New Orleans area. So we definitely went all different directions, but they did originate here in Texas.
All right, thank you for that. And then the other comments were just, saying that it was really interesting. A couple people did agree to a part 2 and other topics. So all of the above approach. And this is just a reminder that, the survey is pretty quick, but it gives us a lot of information to be able to keep providing these online talks. And it helps us get feedback from you on the direction to take. So it looks like there aren't any new questions. This was a pretty cool topic. We delved into some things that I think is probably new for all of us, all while being able to see Shannon look like a cowboy in the mountains.
Watch out.
All right. Well, thank you, Shannon, for the talk, and thank all of you for showing up today. And remember that we have our new schedule out that will go out with our email that will have the copy of this video, the survey, and the next quarter. And then, of course, finishing up this quarter is in 2 weeks, all about basil. Oh, hold on. There's a comment. Let me see. Oh, this person said there is a Black Cowboy Museum in Rosenberg. Interesting guy there. You should visit.
Very cool.
So yeah,
that's just right around the corner too. So thank you.
Yeah, and our Fort Bend counterparts. So yeah, thanks for that tip. Enjoyed so much. Very fascinating. All right. So thank you again, Shannon. Thank you, everyone. And we're out for today. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.